some new potatoes, peas, onions, lettuce. Everybody doing well? All right, all right. Last question. Anybody have any insects out there?
Yeah.
Insects working on anything?
Yeah.
Okay, potatoes? Okay. Did everyone receive the 1 gallon pump up sprayer with some insecticide? Okay. Is anybody need a refill? Okay. Do me a favor. Sometime this evening, I'm sure Ty will be here.
He's downstairs.
Okay, all right. Check with Ty, let him know that you need a refill, and we'll take care of that. Hopefully that insecticide is working for you. If not, we have these specialists here tonight who can help us figure out what we need to be spraying, okay? So, before we turn the program over to our presenter tonight, who I'm going to introduce, I'm going to turn the program over to Martha Nice, who has our special treat for the evening. So Martha, what have you got for us?
Well, since I had heard the broccoli was doing really well, I picked out one of our recipes that has broccoli in it. And I wasn't real sure about this one. It's broccoli grape pasta salad. But after I scraped the bowl out to taste it, once I finished dipping out the little cups, I think it tastes pretty good. So it may be something that you haven't tried yet, a combination. It is whole grain pasta, which is healthier for all of us. And when you put that whole grain pasta into a dish where it's sort of coated with a flavoring, it's a little bit easier for some of us who are maybe a little hesitant to switch over to that whole grain pasta. It does call for some ingredients that I think might be something you haven't tried before. One of them is red wine vinegar, which is not an alcoholic product. It is a vinegar, but this to me is very expensive because usually vinegar is pretty cheap. So I'm going to pass this around, and please don't take a swig out of it. But if you'll smell of it, you can substitute cider vinegar, apple cider vinegar. This is a little bit sweeter, and that makes a difference in your recipes. But if you haven't seen this before, it's $3 a bottle, and I can get a bottle of apple cider vinegar for a lot less than that. So if you're not sure that that's something that you want to spend $3 on, then substitute the apple cider vinegar.
If you know about Aldi, it's cheaper to buy this at Aldi,
Yes.
because I love it.
Well, we need one, because we need it all.
We do.
I don't know if you all know about the Aldi stores. We're not promoting any particular store, but that's what we don't have in our area that does have some things more unusual for us and at a good price. So I always like to go in one if I'm going by. This has, I got that one at IGA. So you can buy both. And then the sweetener in this, many times a broccoli salad that has a sweet vinegar dressing on it will have white sugar in it, but this one is sweetened with honey, which is another one of our Kentucky. This one is not Kentucky crab, but we do have Kentucky crab honey, and any of you that are raising your own bees, you'll have your own, and that'll be even better. All right, well, I'm going to come around with the card. It has pecans, whole wheat pasta. Oh, wow. The recipe calls for 5 slices of turkey bacon, but since they don't sell that in a little bag already cooked and chopped up, it's not turkey bacon in it tonight. It is regular pork bacon, but the turkey bacon, is a healthier option. It's lowering those highly saturated fats. It has seedless red grapes, fresh broccoli. The dressing is made out of low-fat mayonnaise, honey, diced red onion, and the red wine vinegar in that. So it has a little bit of a sweet and tangy taste to it. All right.
Very good. All right. So you're going to
I'm going to pass it. Yes. You want to do to those?
All right. While Martha is passing those out, we'll come back with the other utensils here. I wanted to draw your attention to a number of other programs. Handouts are downstairs. If you didn't pick those up, the very next one, which is a total blast. You guys have got to be here for this. It's next July 14th, around the Monday program. It's the thrill of the grill with the chill. Okay. This program was conceived by Martha Yon and Sarah Brandel last year. We're going to do this over at the Farmers Market Shelter. If you enjoy vegetables and you've never experienced them on the grill, you got to be part of this. It's a lot of fun and great food. So you have the pleasure, if you need to post it on your refrigerator to remind you July 14th.
My part is homemade handcrafted ice cream, so
Oh, there you go.
if you haven't done that,
Dessert
then
first.
you need to.
Okay. All right, our speaker tonight is Dr. Shubin Saha. He is a extension vegetable specialist at the University of Kentucky, the Department of Horticulture. Visiting with Shubin, he has worked down in Florida. He's most recently been working up around Purdue in an area known for a lot of vegetable production, primarily watermelon, cantaloupe. We are really lucky to have Shubin with us tonight. He has a big research and extension program, very, very busy man, and he agreed to come down and visit with us tonight. So he wants to hear your questions, and he'll attempt to answer those. When he has finished his PowerPoint presentation this evening, we are going to invite you to go down to our demo garden. And Dr. Saha is going to be down there. He's going to be looking at our vegetables, pointing out insect and disease problems. Again, continuing to answer your questions about things that you're seeing in your garden. All right? Let's see. Ty, I saw Ty walk in. There he is. If you have your harvest sheets, what you have harvested out of your garden since we met last, if you want to hand those over to Ty, we'd like to collect those. If you don't have them with you tonight, bring them with you at our next meeting. Again, we need to tally up all our vegetable production. We're going to make a really nice report back to our sponsor. All right, I'm going to turn it over to Dr. Saha and let him go.
Thanks, David. So, like David indicated today, we're talking about pests and diseases of horticultural crops, primarily focusing on vegetables. How about that? Is that better? All right. So, what we'll be talking about today is pests and diseases of horticultural crops, really focusing on vegetable crops. What I plan to do is go through and give you a little bit of background on the basic biology of the diseases that we'll typically encounter, as well as some of the insects, because it's really helpful to understand a bit about the biology of these organisms. Because one of the primary things that you have to do is, a lot of times we get questions from commercial farmers, well, what do I spray? I'd say my corn crop, or say a sweet potato crop. Well, what pest do you have? We have to know what pest you have, because it's not just one-shot kill. There's multiple different types of pesticides, insecticides, fungicides, whether they be organic or conventional based, but a lot of them are specific, so you can't just spray any chemical to take care of your problem. So that's why I want to talk about some of the basic biology, because it will help with identification. And if you can't identify it yourself, you can always contact your local ag or horticulture agent in your county, and they should be able to help you with that. If they can't decipher it themselves, they'll usually give it to somebody like Rick Besson or formerly Kenny Siebold, or somebody like myself, and we can help identify what it is so you can find an answer to your question. So we're going to start with diseases first. So there's two basic ways which we can separate disease, and everybody should have a copy of these slides in the handout if you want to follow along or take notes or anything of that nature. So on your left, we have what I would call a non-infectious disease, or we would also sometimes call that abiotic. So it's not an actual organism that's causing the disease. This is actually a nutrient deficiency. So this tomato plant is not getting enough phosphorus, and so that's what we would call a non-infectious disease. So it's not a fungus that's causing the problem, it's not an insect, it's not a mite or anything else, it's actually a deficiency of a nutrient. So what we're more commonly familiar with, and what we typically associate with disease, would be called an infectious disease. So this is actually caused by an organism. It could be a fungi, it could be a bacteria, or it could be a virus. In this case, this is a cucumber planting in a greenhouse in south central Florida that I used to work in, and this is a fungus most commonly known as Pythium. Pythium also causes problems with damping off. Some of you may have heard of damping off. That's often a seedling problem at a very young age. But but the same pathogen can cause death and disease in mature growing plants. So with non-infectious diseases, it's often too much or too little that's causing the problem. So some of those factors can be caused by the water. So is it raining excessive amounts, or are you over irrigating if you are irrigating? What's the heat like? And obviously Mother Nature is typically going to be dictating that. Even in a climate controlled greenhouse, Mother Nature is still impacting what the temperatures are doing within that structure. The first example we gave with fertilizer and nutrients. So you can certainly have too much of a fertilizer as well as too little of a fertilizer. I know some people think, well, there's no way you can have too much fertilizer, but believe me, you can have too much fertilizer, not only having negative impacts on the environment, but some of our research has shown that too much nitrogen will actually cause insect feeding to occur. So it's actually stimulating insect feeding. So don't just think that you can just keep pumping the nitrogen into your plants. No worries, you can actually cause yourself a problem. And then also you can have problems. I don't know if any of you have ever experienced it. I've seen it in commercial fields in different states that I've worked in. But you can have damage from a particular pesticide on the plant. You could have an herbicide that drifts onto your crop. Or you can actually have burning. So sometimes we'll use a horticultural oil. But if you use that in very warm weather, when it's really dry, you can actually burn the plant itself. And so that's a non-infectious disease that you brought on based on applying the product at the less than optimal timing. This is just another example of what would be considered a non-infectious disease. It's just a genetic mutation. They occur naturally in the environment, and periodically that will happen. So this is actually a pepper plant. Usually you think of something with the white, light green, maybe as like an ornamental-based plant, like you can see where you want it in something like coleus. But for a pepper plant, you might look at that and think, what's going on with my pepper plant? So this is just a genetic mutation that's occurred naturally. Again, this is what we would call a non-infectious disease. Another example here, we have muskmelon expressing deficiency of boron. Boron is one of the primary nutrients that is needed by plants for growth and development. And so because there's not enough boron within the soil profile, you see some of this yellowing and some of this burning along the leaf margins in this muskmelon plant. Another non-infectious disease, I don't know if you can make it out, but there was actually supposed to be plants in this section of the field. But all those plants are now dead. That's actually one of the first stops I made when I started working in Indiana. It was a lightning strike. Lightning strike took out all the plants in the area. And sometimes it's pretty hard to figure out if that was what caused it. But you start digging and looking for more and more things that could have caused it. That's really the only thing that could have. And it also did coincide with severe weather that we had at that time. Another example would be ethylene damage. Ethylene is a product that's produced naturally by certain fruits and vegetables, but it can also be produced in a greenhouse where the heater gas is not being exhausted properly. And I've seen this happen already this season. There was a grower who had, in their exhaust system on their propane heater in the greenhouse, it had a couple holes in it. So the exhaust was not escaping out, and the exhaust was giving off a byproduct of ethylene gas, which causes growth disfiguration. I'm not sure if you're not familiar with it, you may not notice it, but notice these lower leaf petioles. You might be able to see it better on your own handout, but they're all downturned. And that's a typical symptom you will associate with ethylene damage. So let's talk about infectious disease now, which really causes probably more problems than anything within the framework of disease. It is an actual living agent, so it's some sort of organism that's alive and that's causing the problems and causing the disease issue. So when we talk about disease with respect to a bacteria, a fungi, or a virus, we break it up into three components. So we call this the disease triangle. So there's 3 points to your triangle. One is a susceptible host. So that's the fruit or vegetable plant that is susceptible to that disease. So for example, pumpkins often get powdery mildew. They are susceptible to powdery mildew. So we have a susceptible host. We also have the pathogen. And so with the example I just gave, the pathogen is the powdery mildew. The fungus is causing the disease problem. But then you also have to have the right environmental conditions, meaning the right amount of light, the right amount of moisture, And one thing I'll tell you in general right now about foliar diseases is a lot of that is tied to leaf wetness or periods of leaf wetness. And so the longer your leaves are wet, the more conducive that environment is to disease development. And so, for instance, how can you modify leaf wetness in an open field or in a greenhouse? You say, well, I'm not going to run a fan through there. Well, if you have a greenhouse, you do have circulation fans. But the other way that you can manipulate the amount of times the leaves are wet to some extent is how densely you planted your crop. So are your rows 3 feet apart or are they 6 feet apart? So the closer your rows are and the closer your plants are within the row, oftentimes is going to lead to more leaf wetness, which in turn leads to more foliar disease. Now, there's a fine line though. You also have, I mean, you're not going to plant your tomatoes 6 feet apart within the row. You're just not going to be using your space efficiently. But then I've seen a lot of guys that push it on the other side with commercial farmers where they really want to pack plants in. And I've seen it come back to bite people more than one occasion. So coming back to this disease triangle, you have the plant, which can succumb to the disease. You have the disease itself, and then you have the environment. And so when you bring all three together in the correct proportions, then you get disease. And that's actually the symptoms of developing on the leaf tissue, whether they be spots or some sort of brown spots, yellow spots, or it could be wilting of the plant. You could have a problem within the root zone as opposed to the above ground parts. So we have different terms. We talk about parasites, plant pathogens, and plant disease. So parasites are any organism that obtains its nourishment from another organism while it's surviving, while it's living. I mean, we can get fungi, we can get bacteria infections, we can get viral infections as humans just the same as plants. Now, they're not the same virus and bacteria and fungi, but it's the same conception. So the plant pathogen is the agent itself, specifically the fungi, bacteria, or virus that's leading to the disease or that's causing it. And then the plant disease itself is the interaction between the host and the environment, which results in your abnormal condition, basically meaning you see damage on the leaf tissue, you see spots on the leaves, or something of that nature. So the primary infectious agents for disease that we'll focus on tonight will be fungi, bacteria, virus, and nematodes. And just to give you a rough idea, when I trained in Florida, 90% of the time, if it is an infectious agent, it's going to be a fungi. Then probably about 5 to 7%, it's going to be a bacteria, and then even less likely a virus. So my point in telling you that is, if you actually have an infectious disease, most of the time it's going to be a fungus. And the reason I bring that up is because fungicides aren't necessarily going to work for a bacterial problem. You might need a bactericide. And then viruses are a whole other case unto themselves, because once plants have virus, you can't get rid of virus. And that plant typically is done. So usually you have to think about other ways of managing. And now nematodes is something that I commonly encountered in Florida, which I'll talk about a little bit. I know that they do exist here in the state of Kentucky. We do have northern root knot nematode, southern root knot nematode, as well as soybean cyst nematode. And they can be problematic depending on your soil type. But I'm really hoping that you guys, as home gardeners, don't encounter this, because they're very difficult to manage, and options available for the home gardener are very limited for nematodes. So we have parasitic fungi, which this is actually a microscopic picture of fungi growing on a host. And then you have saprophytic fungi. So parasitic fungi are actually growing on a living host. Anybody ever seen mushrooms growing on an old log in the woods any place? That's what we would call a saprophytic fungi. It's growing on something that is dead, as opposed to something that is alive. And so what we're encountering with plants, and specifically vegetables, we're not really worried about saprophytic fungi. Because when a plant's dead, we've got a problem to begin with. We're worried about parasitic fungi. And so in this instance, I mentioned damping off. Has anybody ever experienced damping off? Anybody ever heard of damping off or familiar with it? Usually you get a little bit of dark spot at the soil line on that new stem, and the plant will end up collapsing, as you can see here. You see this discoloration, and this plant's getting ready to collapse. You zoom in on that, and you can see that it's actually diminished in the diameter, how big around that stem is. It's starting to shrink, it's starting to decay, and being eaten by. So we talk about infection versus infestation. So the plant itself is infected. It's not infested, it's infected. Where the media itself was infested, meaning that it had a pathogen already present. And that's why when I do things in research or even when I work with commercial growers, we don't save media. We don't reuse from year to year. You use it once and then you start again. Now there are options, or there are options out there. Are they viable or realistic for a home grower? Typically not. So the one thing I know that they do in research at the research greenhouses on campuses is they steam the soil, and that will kill the pathogen. But using steam working with steam can be somewhat dangerous to some extent based on pressure and things, and homeowners, even most commercial farmers, don't have that capability to steam. So coming back to what I said originally, don't reuse your media, and if at all possible, I wouldn't save media from year to year. I would try to buy just what I needed for that season and try to use every bit of it that season. And you know, nothing is wrong with taking some of that media in spring and working it into your garden, things of that nature. It can certainly help the soil too, but I generally don't like to save potting media from one year to the next because I have seen problems with that. So the other thing too is we talk about saving media versus not saving media, but looking here, this is a used unwashed transplant tray, and this is a used washed transplant tray. And so we pretty much have 100% stand in this tray, or we've actually lost some plants in this tray. Now, for my purposes, I will never save trays like that. I will always dispose of them. It's really hard to sanitize them. But as a homeowner, you may be able to, you could take those trays. Usually they're only intended for one season based on the thickness of that plastic. But if you were very careful with them, you could submerge that into a bleach solution and you could sanitize it. But just keep in mind, that's a plastic material, so it's not porous, meaning it's not going to absorb. Anything that will absorb material, like any sort of water, anything like a piece of wood, you can't sanitize that. So for instance, does anybody use stakes for their tomato crop or any other type of tall growing crop? Those are generally wood stakes, and often in the state of Kentucky, it's a tobacco stick. You can't sanitize those sticks. So my recommendation is to not save from year to year. You're going to use new again, year in, year out. Now, if you want to save, you don't want to, get rid of that every year, you can use T-posts. Everybody familiar with T-posts? It's made out of metal, usually painted green. They're a lot more expensive, but you can sanitize that, and you can use that year after year. One thing we've done in our own research farm, we couldn't afford to buy enough T-posts for all the tomatoes that we grow on the farm. So you buy a little bit the first year, and then so you're using some wood stakes intermixed with those T-posts, and then you keep going. As you slowly go, you're getting rid of the wood, and you bought enough T-posts to use at your facility or in your garden. Late blight of tomato and potato is certainly one fungal pathogen, which is problematic, no doubt, for a lot of solanaceous vegetables. So this is the actual tomato fruit. You see this large brown discolored lesion, and then usually on the leaves, you see a very large brown lesion. This is a pathogen that moves very fast. I was at a commercial producer last fall who had some problems with late blight. At that point, he had one lesion about the size of a silver dollar on just about every plant, at least one lesion on every plant. By the next week, the crop was gone. Late blight is a crop which will come through very fast. And I would think it would be problematic in this type of region, at least looking at this farm, because you have these valleys, you have these low-lying areas where dew is going to sit, fog is going to sit, so it can become problematic. But the one positive thing about late blight is it doesn't overwinter in this state. It has to come in each year. But if you're working in a situation like a greenhouse or high tunnel, things change. And I've seen where a gentleman had late blight on his tomatoes and was planting potatoes right below that, and they're similar crops and they share the same disease. And so those potatoes are going to allow that pathogen to overwinter in that high tunnel because it's warmer than the outside temperature. And this is just a microscopic image of the fungus that actually causes late blight. So these little filamentous strands we call hyphae, and these little round oval shapes are the spores or the reproductive structures. And this is the type of pathogen that spreads in wet conditions, and it spreads with it moves with water. These types of spores survive well in water and can move within running water. So we've got the hyphae, and we've got the spores, as I've already indicated. This is another pathogen we're seeing quite a bit of. I saw it in Indiana, and I know I've seen it also in the state of Kentucky now as well. You'll see it in the open field, but you'll often see it in high tunnels. And this is known as white molded tomato, or timber rot, some people refer to it as. But this is a stem of a tomato plant that's been split open, and you see these little black structures, and those are the reproductive structures of the fungus. They look kind of like mouse droppings sometimes, or rat droppings. If you crack that open, those can get back down into the soil, and then they can overwinter and survive in the soil. And so one thing a lot of times with commercial farmers, they rotate. A lot of times when I work with home gardeners, they don't rotate. Or they just don't have the capability. They don't have enough land to rotate to. It's just not feasible. But in this type of instance, when you have diseases like this coming in, some people will just let it go. But what we recommend is remove that from your garden, rogue that plant out. It's not going to do any good. It's not going to produce any more fruit for you this year. It's not going to produce good fruit, even if it does, most likely. So don't leave it so it can spread to your other tomato plants that haven't got it, or so it's not leaving these small reproductive structures in the soil for when you plant next year in your garden. So sanitation is one of the biggest things, whether you're a conventional grower, whether you're an organic grower. Sanitation of your growing area is very important. It can help you avoid a lot of problems down the road. So let's shift gears. Let's talk about bacteria. I know we're really focused on vegetables. This is a good example of bacteria. Some of you are probably familiar with fire blake in apples and in pears, where you get this fire appearance on the shoots. Can move quite fast. Some of you might have seen this problem before in tomatoes. You've got these lesions on the tomato fruit themselves. That's a bacterial spot of tomato. Then we also have bacterial canker. And so again, this is where sanitation comes into play, and that's removing some of this diseased material. Now, if I was working with a farmer in Florida that was, say, growing maybe 5,000 acres of tomatoes, it's not really feasible for them to go out and remove plants like that. However, if I was a home gardener or a much smaller scale farmer, removing and roguing plants does become a viable option to help reduce your problems in the future. And remember what I said earlier about the tomato sticks? Actually not being, you can't sanitize them because they're porous. This is actually a little test strip from a company, known as Agvia. And so it makes things really nice where you can basically take the plant tissue, you put it in a bag with a special solution, you crush it up, and you stick this test strip in there. And it will tell you whether it's positive or negative for a specific pathogen. In this case, bacterial canker. The pathologist that I used to work with, you took a piece of that steak, put it in that solution, put it in the test strip, and it tested positive for bacterial canker on the used tomato steak. So you basically, the grower brought it into his or her field and trying to proliferate the pathogen unknowingly. And that's why we say sanitation is big. You say, well, I can try to clean those. No, you can't. You can't effectively clean them. Really don't bother wasting your time on something like that. Let's talk about some virus problems. We've got zucchini yellow mosaic virus as one example. This is in pumpkin. It causes a lot of distortion and mottling in the growth of the leaves themselves. And this is actually transmitted by an insect, an aphid. Is anybody familiar with aphids? I would think so. So aphids not only cause you problems because they feed on your plant and they cause damage that way, but they can also transmit virus. And so that becomes a real problem. And I know zucchini yellow mosaic virus is a real problem for pumpkin growers that I work with in Indiana. It could be a problem for pumpkin growers in this state. It's usually later in the season because your pumpkins are planted later in the season that you're encountering this. So you really can't manage the virus. You have to manage the vector, what's transmitting the virus. And so as long as you've got aphids running rampant through your field, you're not going to do anything about the virus. But if you can get your aphid population under control, you can try to manage this virus to some extent. Here it is on pumpkin, much more even severe on these distorted leaves. I mean, you might not even see that they're leaves, but that was supposed to be a true leaf. And then also, you say, well, what does it matter if I can still get a pumpkin that looks good that I can sell?
That's a scary one.
if you found that niche market, you might be able to bid up a bunch of those and sell those, but by and large, you're not going to be able to sell that. It's an unmarketable product. And then let's touch on nematodes briefly. Nematodes are microscopic worms, basically. So it's a very, very tiny worm. And this is just a diagram showing the different parts. You've got digestive organs in green, the reproductive organs in blue, some of the other different components like muscles and nerves. And what they most commonly have, so this is the head end right here, and this is the tail end. They basically have a needle for a mouth. It's like a hypodermic needle, and they retract it, and then they stick it back out into the roots of the plant, typically. And so this is a muskmelon plant, the root system of a muskmelon plant. Does anybody find anything wrong with those roots? They look more abnormal.
Slightly.
So there should be smooth, clean roots. And we've got all these what we call galls or root knots, hence the name root knot nematode. And basically what has happened is that female nematodes put her mouth part in and pierce an individual cell, which causes one cell to expand much greater than all the others, and that's why you end up with these galls. And as I said before, I really hope none of you run into nematodes because there's not a lot of good options for nematode management. The ones that are available are very expensive and really not even accessible in this state. Methyl bromide is a fumigant you could use in the past. As you go to some of the larger vegetable-producing states, they can still access it to some extent, but it's really not a practical way that we can manage in this state for nematode problem. So within this whole framework, I know we titled it Pest and Disease Management, but we really look at things from a more holistic perspective, and we call it integrated pest management. So you're looking at all different ways of managing the system. And so what I like it to is you have a toolbox. IPM is like a toolbox. And so in your toolbox, you've got a hammer, a screwdriver, a wrench, things of that nature. Well, an IPM for vegetables or for plants in general, you've got different tools in that toolbox. Now, they may not be like a hammer or a wrench, but it's still a tool. And so one of the primary examples of IPM, and one thing, again, whether you're organic or whether you're doing it conventionally, scouting for pests. Because remember earlier we talked about how we're going to identify the pests. Well, how do you know that the pest is there? You have to be going through that garden routinely or going through that plant routinely. As a home gardener, I would think you're making frequent passes through there because you're your only source of labor. You're not paying somebody else to manage your crop. So you're going through there frequently. And then we'll talk more in depth about ways, and we can even show you ways of doing it out in the field when we get out there later this evening. But scouting for pests is one of the most critical things that you can do within an integrated pest management program. And really my own experiences, really being on top of my scouting has really been able to allow me to avoid pesticide application in many instances where others couldn't have gotten away without it. And that's because we know what's in there. We're continuously going and checking and looking for some of these issues. So some of the other things too is what we have is insect threshold, and what we mean by insect threshold, just because you see one doesn't necessarily mean that you need to go get that sprayer and get ready to go spray for a crop, or you need to do something about that. It has to be in the right proportion, basically. And we'll talk a little bit more about that when we get into biological control for insect pests. So one of the things that IPM has allowed us to do is minimize pesticide usage, whether it be conventional or organic pesticide. So on a traditional calendar-based spray schedule, every 7 days, in a melon crop, we're looking at 8 fungicide applications per year. If we used a weather-based IPM system, which is using disease to forecast when conditions are conducive to that disease, we've dropped down to 6 fungicide applications per year. And so that's cutting 25% of your fungicide application, which is fairly significant, especially if you're doing this to make a living, because they're certainly not cheap. Excuse me. Corn earworm. This is the corn earworm larvae. It's quite problematic on corn in general, both sweet corn. It can also be a problem on some field corn. But we have insect thresholds, and so frequently what we do is we'll set up traps to detect when the moths are flying. And so basically, if we're not catching at least 10 moths per night in the trap, we're not at a high enough level to justify an application of insecticide. So let's talk about managing disease using strategies from the disease triangle. So you can manage, we talked about you had to have a susceptible host. Well, some of the genetic material we get now, some of these seeds have, through traditional breeding programs, disease resistance bred into them. And so that's very helpful. So when I work with watermelon quite frequently, we work with a lot of hybrid species, and Fusarium wilt is one of the pathogens, one of the fungi that is continuously a problem. But through traditional breeding, some of the seed companies have come up with some watermelon hybrids that have some resistance to this particular disease. And so you see there's no plant here, and so that plant was highly susceptible. This plant is starting to wilt, as is this one. But you see some of these plants here, which are still very upright and looking quite well. And it's because they have some natural genetic resistance to the disease. The other thing we talk about, looking at, we have to have a viable pathogen. Well, we can manage the pathogen through sanitation, either by cleaning seed or using clean propagation materials through our production techniques. Because seeds can bring disease, and they do quite often. I've seen them where tomatoes will have bacterial diseases within the seed itself. I've seen it with watermelons and cantaloupes as well, and other types of fungal pathogens. So you've got to start with clean material. And then as far as managing the environment, tilling in the fall, rotating your crops, and also looking at planting dates are ideal if you can manipulate that to some extent within your system. Let's move on to arthropod pests now. I want to just give you some basics on insects. Again, the reason I'm going over this is because I want you to be a little bit more comfortable potentially identifying what your problem is. It's not always easy to identify the species, but the more you are able to figure out what it is, the easier it is for your agent to help you and further along the process for all of us to help you. Because whether you're a home gardener, whether you're a commercial producer,